So good morning officially again to all of you, and welcome, and thank you so much for taking time today to join us for today's webinar. My name is Lisa Dar. I'm the Director of Industry Relations and Professional Development with the Tourism Industry Association of Nova Scotia. And we're really excited to be able to offer today's session to our industry partners from around the province. And as part of our ongoing efforts to support and inform industry, Tynes has been leading and coordinating a number of different files in response to the COVID-19 pandemic. So in addition to our Tourism Strong Digital Hub, our advocacy that we've been working on for targeted and better supports for operators, and some of the more practical tools that we've been rolling out, like the Clean It Right program, we've also been delivering a series of webinars that are sort of focused on timely and relevant topics as things shift and evolve over this last 18 months. And today's webinar is part of broader support that we're providing to industry through our Tourism Reactivation for Industry, or our TRI program, which is a partnership with Tourism Nova Scotia that we are offering. That's focused on accessing expertise to support industry pivoting and getting ready to broadly reopen again. So the subject matter today really is uncharted territory for many, and we know that the conversation is very much going to be reflective of that. There's going to be a lot of questions. We're going to endeavor to answer as many as possible following our formal presentation from our speaker. But we commit to connecting you for follow-up support through the TRI program if needed. If additional expertise or one-on-one support is needed, please do reach out following, and we can help coordinate that. And now I'm just going to move on to our introduction of today's speaker for our webinar. Ron Pizzo is a graduate of Dalhousie Law and was called to the bar in 1987. As a partner at Pink Larkin, he specializes in employment law. He's recognized as a leader in providing strategic and insightful advice around workplace-related issues. He has over 30 years experience as an advocate and a litigator, and Ron is certified in a number of coaching and mediation techniques. He's consistently been ranked by his peers across the country as one of Canada's top labor and employment lawyers. So we're very fortunate to have him joining us here today to share some insight into this new proof of vaccine policy that we are anticipating coming in a few very short weeks, how privacy concerns should be managed when it comes to these topics. And also he'll respond to your questions around employment law related to vaccination policies for staff. Ron's presentation is going to be a little more informal. He's not going to use a whole bunch of PowerPoint slides, but share his perspective. And we're going to also have time following for some questions and answers. So we're going to be moderating that. Please use your question and answer button at the bottom or top of your screen, or you can use the chat section as well. We will be monitoring that, and we will follow up and handle moderating those questions accordingly. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Ron, and in advance say thanks so much for joining us on this important topic today, Ron.
Well, thank you for having me. So yeah, I've been doing labor and employment law for a long time, and I think I'm going to change my bio and not let people know when I graduated from law school. It makes me feel a little old, but so I have some general comments I want to start off with from the COVID, the mandatory vaccine policies, the policies that people are talking about, mandatory masking. Those have all been a big topic of discussion among the labor bar itself, because there's no clear law on this yet. There's no clear direction on this yet. We're all going on first principles. We don't know ultimately what's going to happen. But the general consensus, I will tell you this, is that we do believe that a properly drafted mandatory vaccination policy, with exceptions and accommodations for people who can't have the vaccines, will likely be upheld. They'll likely be found reasonable. So that seems to be the general consensus because of the safety concerns with COVID. Now, that's as of today, given where we're at. Of course, that might change. Again, it all changes also with the effectiveness of treatment. So if we come up with a super duper vaccine that's 100% effective, well then, things, and the risk really goes down, the advice we're going to give you might change again. So that's one general comment. The other general comment I want to make is this. we're going to be talking about taking reasonable actions and reasonable standards. And everyone has to understand that reasonableness is an objective standard. There are, there's what the healthcare providers are saying, what the health professionals are saying, and then there are some people who are expressing different points of view. And so, and some people may have different points of view about the safety or the effectiveness of the vaccine. But at the end of the day, it's not a subjective, I think, standard of this is what I think is right. It's the objective standard. And the objective standard is really based on the weight of authority. So, and the weight of authority, generally speaking, is with the healthcare professionals, like, and the people who are in public health, like Dr. Strang, the scientists. So that's, I think, going to define the objective standards with people in the science, what they're saying, even though some people may disagree with that. But that's generally the objective standard. And that's a standard to which you have to work toward in deciding what kind of policies you may or may not have in your workplace. So with that, and before we start getting into this whole, what policies can I have? Everyone has to consider what obligations you have, especially in the tourism industry. So there's some obligations that you have which are common with all employers. There's an obligation to have a safe workplace. And the duty is employers must use all reasonable precautions to safeguard their employees from any dangers in the workplace. That's not just machinery and tools, but that also includes the environment. And it also includes a duty to monitor employees. So you have to take reasonable steps. You're going to have some interesting questions coming up with this. For instance, sometimes, what if you have employees who are vaccinated, who are then going to be working with maybe employees who are not vaccinated, or they're concerned about that? Do those vaccinated employees have a right to refuse? What if those, like under Occupational Health and Safety Act, so that statute may start rearing its head in that respect. Does it make a difference that the employees who are vaccinated, who are afraid to work with unvaccinated employees, also have children at home who are unvaccinated? Because, from the science, for example, apparently if you're completely vaccinated, you can still be a carrier and you can bring the COVID home. Are you going to, so that's one area. So that's within the workplace. But then there's also, in the tourism industry, there's this duty of innkeepers, or people who deal with the public, to keep the public safe. So if the public comes onto your premises, there's all this occupiers liability. And so there are duties there to keep the premises reasonably safe for customers, for their use in the customary manner with reasonable care. So that duty is depending on what hazards are reasonably foreseeable. So you can have a situation of, is it reasonable to expose your customers, the people who come to your place, to possible COVID, because you have people who are unvaccinated and they're more likely to get it? Is it reasonable to allow unvaccinated guests come onto your premises because they may infect other guests? Or are you creating an unsafe environment for your workers if you let unvaccinated people come in to your premises? So there are all these issues about not just caring about your employees, people who work for you, but also caring about the environment generally, and all the obligations, and all the possible ways that people can get infected from each other, with each other, which raises a whole bunch of concerns about what your policies are going to look like, not just for your workers, but also for the people who come to visit. What's interesting, though, and this is an interesting thing, if you look at the Occupiers Liability Act, where a lot of this liability comes on from people coming onto your premises, the Act does have some provisions where you can modify the duties and obligations, or you limit your liability by having agreements where you kind of tell your customers or your guests who are coming on your premises about the risks, about the steps you've taken, and advising them that despite all that, you've taken your best efforts, reasonable steps, and they may still be subject to COVID. And if you were to do those sorts, they still may catch COVID because there's nothing that's 100% for sure. But having those kind of written limitations of liability, which are reasonable, that may help minimize that risk for you. So that's kind of where we start. We've got all these risks, you've got all these considerations. It's not just in relation to people who are vaccinated at work, but their concerns about bringing COVID home, about people not wanting to be vaccinated for personal reasons. You're going to have to consider whether there's some people who can't be vaccinated for medical reasons, and that raises a whole other area of accommodation. Under the Human Rights Act, for instance, those people have to be accommodated somehow, and you have to take a look at reasonable efforts, and you have to accommodate them to the point of undue hardship. So, was wearing PPE going to be enough? What kind of personal protective things do you need? Are masks enough? Do you want masks and shields? Do you want masks, shields, and gloves? Do you want to say, how often do you wash your hands? Things like that. And then you have once you've got all these things you're worried about, you also have the practical problem of getting a workforce, right? The practical problem finding people to work. And sometimes you may have policies that are so restrictive that it may, in fact, cripple your business because you can't get people to work for you. So these are all things that you have to weigh when you come up in creating your policy, and you have to act reasonably. Now, I will say that if the government, and it can, for instance, the Health Protection Act, or like the orders they institute, they have legislative authority to kind of determine what the standards would be. And to the extent that they do more of this work and don't leave the guesswork up to you, the more that you are kind of relieved of the obligation of having to be the bearer of bad news to say to some people, this is what you're going to have to do. And, you don't have to, because it's not you, it's the government that's doing it. And, if they take on that task, that's not a bad thing because it makes it easier. So when we start looking at this question about, can you have a mandatory policy, when we start getting to that, the real issue is, are you able to collect information about whether someone is vaccinated? Because that's theoretically private information. And here we have some assistance from, I guess, the common law, the general principles. There are also the PIPEDA principles, but let's look at the general principles. Right now, as it currently stands, if you have a worker who is off work because of injury or disability, and they want to return to work, an employer has the obligation to make sure that the workplace is safe, and that when the person comes back to work, it's not just safe for that person, but it's also safe for the rest of the co-workers. And of course, the safety concern is different for different industries. But for instance, if you're working heavy equipment, well, there's, all the physical requirements are generally much higher, right, than you may be if someone's working as a greeter or a front desk in an inn, for example. But where there are concerns about safety and someone being able to come back to work or being able to work, there's a general rule, which is an employer is entitled to whatever medical information the employer requires to make an informed decision about safety. So as it stands right now, even before COVID, even before this issue of vaccines, there's a general recognition at law that employers are entitled to collect medical information. The question is, how do they do that? And what medical information? So I don't expect that that general law will change. I think that that general law will apply in this context as well. Is it reasonable for you? So, and then when we look at the medical information, the test by the courts always has been, you have to ask for reasonable information, the least intrusive amount of information, and you have to secure that information whichever way you get it. So that means you can't share it with anyone else. You have to have a way of securing the privacy of that information, but you can still collect it. So with COVID, I don't see how those rules go away. If you're worried about your safety, health and safety and security of the workplace, you do have the right to collect that information from your employees. I think also when you think about guests, the government is doing a lot of things to help you. For instance, they're bringing in this, a lot of them are going to have these passports, these vaccine passports, this proof of vaccination. So asking for that information, if people are required to maintain it, is not going to be problematic. And I don't think it will be. So at the end of the day, if you do have a vaccine, so if you do have a vaccine policy, you will be able to collect the information as long as it's for the safety of the workplace, and as long as your policy is reasonable. So, and reasonable requires you to really, if I were a person thinking about bringing in such a policy, what would I do? I would, gather all the information I could from the public health officials. I would look at the government publications. I would look at the science or talk to people that's readily available. Maybe even your association may have someone like Dr. Strang or somebody come forward to talk about, or even Lisa Barrett, for instance, Dr. Lisa Barrett, to talk about all the concerns, all the relevant considerations based on science. Once you take those into consideration, you can start drafting reasonable policies or have a lawyer help you draft a reasonable policy. And that would probably include the ability to request vaccine information. And so that's how you get around that whole issue. And that's how we start putting in place a policy that would allow you to require your workers to provide evidence of vaccination to be able to work, if that's where you want to go. You may want to go with proof of vaccination or adequate PPE, personal protective equipment, whatever that is. You can have a mix, and you can make those decisions based on that information as well. But once you have the objective information, you can start drafting the necessary policies for your workplace. You can also start drafting or putting together the policies or information for your guests as they come. There haven't been too many cases that have really tested. What I should say also, if you do ultimately have a proof of vaccination policy, what most lawyers think is that if you follow the PIPEDA principles, that's the protection of, I always get PIPEDA wrong, but the acronym, it's the personal information legislation. Anyways, you get the legislation, the PIPEDA legislation, the PIPEDA principles, and there are 10 of them. If you follow the PIPEDA principles in your collection strategy, then you're going to be okay. So the first principle is accountability. That means you have to have one person who's accountable for collecting and storing the information, and one person who is required to be compliant with preserving the information. If you identify the purpose, and the purpose again is what we just talked about, safe workplace. This is why you're collecting the data. So the third thing is you get consent from people. So we're going to deal with the issue if someone refuses to consent and refuses to give you the information and what steps you can take. But asking for consent from the person giving it to you, limiting collection so you get as little information as possible, limiting the use, disclosure, and retention. So if you don't keep the information, if you just limit its use. That's another factor. Accuracy, make sure that the information you collect is accurate. Have safeguards in place. So for instance, in some employment circumstances where they're dealing with much more complicated medical files, they'll actually have a whole department that collects the medical information, keeps them separate from personnel files, or keeps them separate in locked cabinets. Openness. Openness means that the person from whom you collect the information knows that you've collected the information and that they're aware of what you've done with it and how you're going to keep it, how you're going to maintain it, or how you're going to get rid of the information once you've collected it. Then there's the individual access. So if there's an individual, give them a right to access their own information that you've collected so they can see whether it's accurate or not. And then the final one is challenging compliance. So for example, if an individual accesses the files, I want to see what information you have on me. No, that's not accurate. Then you need a process where you can resolve those issues. So if you follow those 10 principles, and again, some of it's going to be very easy to do, but following those 10 principles are pretty much going to assure you that whatever way you collect this data, collect this information is going to be just fine. And for many people, even for guests, like you really need to keep the information in any event. Like if they show you the passport once and they're gone and you got it, you just noted it, done, right? You need to keep that information. So now we get into the issue of what happens when someone refuses. I'm not going to give you the information. I'm not going to agree to your policy. I'm not going to agree to things. Well, for guests, it's pretty easy. You just don't let them in, right? For workers, it gets a bit difficult. A bit more. The question is just a little more complicated. What I will tell you is this: most of you are working in non-union settings. And in a non-union setting, you generally have the right to terminate somebody if they don't comply. You have generally terminate anybody for any reason. The question is, do you have to pay money? Is it for cause or not for cause? And if it's not for cause, you have to pay some money. If it's for cause, you don't. So cause are things like an individual, whether the conduct is incompatible with the duties and obligations of the employer, whether it's incompatible with the employer's business, and whether, for instance, if they've lied about their vaccination status, whether they've been willfully disobeying it, and whether something amounts to just cause for termination requires a consideration of, was there a wrong? And obviously there is if they don't want to comply. And secondly, what are the circumstances around the misconduct? Why did they do what they did? Why did they refuse to mask? Did this refusal to take the vaccine, or to tell you that they haven't taken the vaccine, or refusal to take the vaccine, is it inconsistent with their obligations? And again, the obligations that you're looking at are safe work environments, but also safety for guests as well. So those are all the obligations. If someone refuses to participate in a policy, you also have other options. For instance, you can say you don't have to terminate, you can suspend, you can say, look, you can't work here until you do this. Or if you do have alternative measures, I've dealt with one workplace where they have a key employee who just does not want to vaccinate. And so what they've been able to work out is a situation where the person can work from home, and the person can come in and do whatever duties they need to do on site after hours on weekends, for example, and they can do it, but they have to follow certain measures for masking, for cleaning after they finish their work. So they've been able to work around that. But those are different types of ways you can work around issues. There have been some cases in the union setting, which are the very first cases, because arbitration goes a lot faster than civil cases, where the mandatory COVID testing, this is pre-vaccine, has been upheld. So policies that have required mandatory COVID testing, there's one in Ontario, there's one in Nova Scotia, CUPE versus Breton Ability Center, and that was in the healthcare setting. Their concern was, of course, these care homes for elderly people. The concern was transmitting the disease to elderly people, and mandatory testing, mandatory masking, mandatory PPE, and in those cases have all been upheld as reasonable policies given the concerns. So what I would do, I guess, from all of this, if we were to outline some steps of what type of policy you may or may not want to have, is number one, you would look at what are your concerns, and the concerns are based not only on health of your workers' families, because they may transmit. It's also to guests and also to your business generally, because if COVID goes through your business is going to be shut down. So those are general concerns. You have to base your concerns on the science. What's the science telling you about vaccines, effectiveness of vaccines, effectiveness of other measures? You also have to consider whether it's practical. Is it really practical to have other measures? Is it practical to have a mixed group, some vaccinated, some not vaccinated? It may not be. What the measures the government's putting in place, that goes all in the mix of what you do when you start to create your policy. Then you create your policy around the vaccine, and if it's a mandatory vaccine policy, the policy not only, so that's the sort of like the number one PIPEDA principles are you're identifying the purpose, you're identifying the reason, and then you tell people about it, and then you put in the PIPEDA things like what are you going to collect, what are you going to keep, how long are you going to keep it, how are you going to keep it private, who's going to be the accountable person. So that can all be spelled out in the policy and brought to people's attention so that their protection, so that their privacy is protected. With guests, you may also want to have some kind of statement so they're all aware of it when they come to talk about COVID, to talk about the measures you've taken, to say these are the steps and these are the best steps we can take, and urging them to take precautions. You can ask them for proof of vaccine under similar circumstances, and if the government does bring in these passports, that'll just make things a lot easier. And then your policy, you may also want to lay out what your responses are going to be in terms of if someone doesn't comply. And then we have to talk about, at that point, accommodation. So if some people have legitimate grounds for, some protected grounds on the Human Rights Act that are legitimate for not getting vaccinated because of health or disability, then is it possible to accommodate? And you only have to accommodate to the point of undue hardship. And given the nature of your organization, if it comes to the point where you cannot accommodate this person without undue hardship. So for instance, I mentioned that other case where they had the key employee. If it was not possible to accommodate that employee the way the business was able to do, then at that point, you can either suspend or maybe even terminate the employee or tell them they can't work here for as long as the risk of COVID exists. And at the point of undue hardship, then that's it. that's kind of the lay of the land. I can certainly answer questions. I did notice one about religious accommodation. That's going to be an interesting one, right? Because, you know, you're going to have to, there's a lot to prove. Like disability is clear. It's clear why people can't take certain vaccines because they may have immunocompromised or there are some conditions. But what I've heard, what I've seen from the experts is that there are very limited few numbers of exemptions that doctors will give to someone for not getting vaccinated for medical reasons. So that's basically it. So I said half an hour, I'm stopping here and I can take questions.
That was really informative so far, I think, Ron. Thank you so much. And there's a lot to unpack there in terms of both, what needs to be taken into consideration when it comes to both an operator's perspective as it pertains to creating obviously that we all want to have the safest workplaces for our teams. We also want to ensure that our guests are being put in the safest and most enjoyable work experiences possible. When you think about sort of this process of where people are looking for potential exclusions, and I think this comment was how far would those accommodations go for employees employees as reasons to not be vaccinated. I think you covered a fair amount of that already, and also there was from the same person there was this a bit of a clarification point around if your employee is not a member of a recognized religious group and does not have a medical condition, really, are there any other circumstances that would be considered a reason for not partaking in that?
So you don't. The beautiful thing about being the employer is that you're not the one who has to figure all that out, right? It's for the employee to tell you what the reasons are.
Mm-hmm.
It's for them to come forward. So you don't have to mind read, you don't have to guess. They have to lay out the grounds and they have to substantiate and prove. So the onus is on them in the accommodation thing. Right. So if they're saying they can't be vaccinated for medical reasons, well, you could say, okay, give me the medical note that actually says that. And if you're not happy with a medical note, you can, you may have to challenge that because I think some of it may depend on who gives the note, right?
Mm-hmm.
So,
mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And then again, public health would be a great assistance in terms of whether there are real exemptions or not. So
Mm-hmm.
everyone has to play their part. And so even if there is an exemption, it does not necessarily mean that person just gets to work.
Right. So, and I'll roll back to that in a moment, because I think the other component that needs to be considered in here is as well is, there's that element of if I'm not having this policy around or whatever my policy is around vaccination, what element of testing may fall into that as well, in terms of using testing as another basis for that. So I'll put that out there as an option, but I do want to ask, this has been a pressing question from a lot of our operators out there. They're receiving inquiries from visitors from outside of the region, whether that be from other parts of Canada, the US, and beyond. As our borders are reopening, the question really is, what can I ask my visitors in terms of their vaccinations when they're making reservations or inquiring to stay with us?
I think, it's same reasonable, it's again, back to reasonableness, right? So I think the vaccine passport's going to help you a lot with that, because once they're in place and they're coming, then you can ask them, I need to see your vaccine passport, end of story, right? Mm-hmm. You can, as a condition of the contract, say, you can't come here unless you've been shown, because it's a private contract. You're actually executing a contract. So you can say, if you have valid grounds, that we're not going to rent rooms to people who are not vaccinated. You could say that, right? Or you could say, and this is less I think this is something you have to figure out. I mean, you'd have to warn your guests that if they come on the site and they're not vaccinated, that you're not going to be liable if they catch COVID. You've taken reasonable efforts, but your vaccination status, that's your own risk. That third option is something you can say, but it doesn't. You have to weigh it's an issue that you have to weigh the overall impact of your business, because you may find vaccinated people saying, I don't want to come, and who's the majority now? Vaccinated. Who can cross the border, don't they? And how do they get across the border? They have to provide proof of vaccine already. So, there's a lot of common sense there that you can use to your advantage.
And from another operator, thank you for that sort of clarification. Another operator is asking, would offering takeout food for unvaccinated restaurant guests be an example of accommodating to undue hardship?
So you're not talking about accommodating guests. The undue hardship only applies with your workers, but that could be a measure that you could put in to protect the work environment. So if that's something you can do to protect your workers and the people who work for you, then that's an option, right? So undue hardship only applies to people who would have an employment relationship with you. However, alternate measures and alternate policies to try to expand your business, right? If those things work and they're reasonable, then that's something you may want to try. Yep.
So as a privately owned restaurant, asks another question, am I obliged to let customers into my restaurant who are unable to get vaccinated? Or could we say we're actually only admitting fully vaccinated customers? If we're obliged to let them in, what exactly are they supposed to show us for documentation?
Well, I guess this is where we're looking to the government for the documentation part for the passports, right? Right now, we have a lot of rules around masking and the health protection orders that are in place, which are there to minimize the risks. And so it's an easy thing, right? The difficulty arises when they go to phase 5, where that phase is, and no masking is required. Then the vaccination issue comes squarely, in play. And what we're hoping, right, is that the passports will be in place. I mean, they're in place in Quebec right now. I don't know, my son's there, he's studying, and he had to get a passport. He can't go anywhere without showing the vaccine passport, which proves his vaccination. Ontario's coming out with it. I would expect that Atlantic Canada would be coming out with it. But, you can refuse service to people who refuse to provide proof of vaccination. And when I was asked to provide proof of vaccination coming into the province, I just downloaded my vaccination card that I got after my second vaccine, and that was enough. And I would suspect that would be enough if you were to do that, if that's what you had, a policy that says you have to be vaccinated to come here.
Okay. So with the health authorities, announcing that vaccine passports or proof of vaccine are necessary for guests coming into an accommodation property, so staying at an inn or cottages or whatever the case may be, and not participating in gathering events, if they're just coming as a leisure traveler, for example, can we still require for fully vaccinated guests under these circumstances? So similar to the restaurant, I'm assuming would be the answer to
Yes.
that. We can still make that determination. Should there be consideration given to the impact on our employees then? I think, again, this is a bit of a catch-22 that a lot of employers are facing, is that there are not requirements in place necessarily for the guest and or for their staff. So it seems odd to have in place for one element of your operation, and yet those people coming face to face with those other staff or guests not requiring it.
Right. So I think it's like, it's doubly hard for, like the innkeeper or the restaurant owner, right? Because the work environment that the staff works in is not just, the people they work with. It's also the people they come into contact with. And so if when you think about just from the simple perspective, just solely from the perspective of providing a safe workplace, The workplace is your staff, each other, and the guests. That's the environment. And the environment has to be safe. And it goes beyond, and this is going to be the interesting issue, because I do think, and we really haven't had to face this yet, but it's not just the safety of the staff. So we say you're vaccinated, you're fine, don't worry about it. It's this, what if their staff member has children who are unvaccinated? Because you can be a carrier, and so you can bring it home and infect a lot of people and hurt people. So was that part of the safety? I would argue it is, right? So yeah, so when you're putting your policies in place, even for your guests, you have to be concerned in the entire environment for your staff as well, who can come into contact with people who may have COVID if they're not properly vaccinated. And again, look, this is just reasonable care, right? It's not, you're not an insurer, you're not expected to be perfect, you're not expected to have no mistakes, you're expected to take reasonable steps. Breakthrough infections are still possible. So it's not this burden of getting it perfect so no one ever gets sick, so no one ever gets COVID from my establishment. It's just, what can I reasonably do to make this work? And also take into consideration your business as well.
So Ron, the restaurateur who had posed the earlier question is just advising that they still don't necessarily feel that they're really clear on this. As a privately owned restaurant, they are permitted to say, yes, I only want fully vaccinated customers to come in. They can make that decision for themselves as a business if they wish to do so. If they are obliged to let them in as a guest, from a documentation perspective, showing proof of those vaccines, that downloaded electronic, for example, if you've got them in Nova Scotia, you have your electronic notification that's come in. That is the proof that you would say is the right documentation to be used.
So what we're saying is that should be enough, right? So here's the problem, right? A lot of this stuff we don't know. So a lot of the things I'm talking to you about are based on first principles that generally apply in the workplace. These things haven't been tested in court, right? This is all by common law development. And the vaccine is, this pandemic is thrown quite a wrench in things and has created scenarios and considerations not tested at law, right? We don't often have cases where we're worried about, infecting people. You have the flu and the cold, but that's not such a big deal. Everyone lives with those, but this is different, right? So I would think right now that having that kind of proof of vaccine is, in fact, that's the only thing you can get right now. There's just nothing else. I don't know. I'm not aware of any other information that's available, but hopefully the government will have these vaccine passports that people sign up for, which should give you some comfort and make it easier for you to say, yes, you're in, no, you're not. Or you may want to designate a part of your restaurant, for instance, if you feel like you want to have those people to say, you go sit over there, right? Or we put fans on you, we put blowers on you, we do all this stuff on, or let them do takeout, right? So, there are other ways to deal with situations. Yeah.
Ultimately, as a private operator, you have that ability to make that decision for your business. Okay. Just a quick follow-up note to that, getting back to the sort of medical note exemption component, what actually constitutes a valid medical note? Is it just a note from a doctor?
Again, that is, I can tell you, in the law, right? It's always a big bone of contention, even for regular disability things. But generally speaking, if a doctor gives a note, and it's a reputable doctor, right? A family doctor, that's generally enough to say, I can't be vaccinated. So if they can't be vaccinated, again, remember that doesn't mean they get to work. It means, okay, you can't be vaccinated. Are there other reasonable measures? And if they're not, then maybe you can't work. So it's not a get out of jail card, not a get out of jail free card, right?
Right. And it's not just black and white. It may require further conversation, obviously,
Sure.
with the experts.
And that's something you can, each individual operator through their lawyers can go and create and craft policies that deal with those situations so that people know up front, if I'm not vaccinated, this is what we're going to do. So that they know that it's not just, right,
Okay.
an easy ride.
So here's a quick question from somebody that's saying, from an event perspective, we've got, you pre-purchase an event ticket online. Can you ask the guests if they're vaccinated before they purchase the ticket? And, if so, do you need to see then proof of vaccination when they actually come to the event? So I go online, I buy my concert ticket or my event ticket, and then I'm coming to the event. I've got my ticket, but I've already shown my proof of vaccine purchasing the ticket. I'll need to show it again for access.
Hey, well, it's interesting. Well, you definitely, the problem is this: someone buys a ticket. How do you know that the person who presented the proof of vaccine about the ticket is actually the guest coming in? So when do you ask for proof of vaccine, right? Should you ask when they purchase a ticket, or should you ask when they come in? And so what you do when they purchase a ticket, you may just want to tell them, we will be asking you for proof of vaccine before we let you into the event. I think that makes the most sense because, you can't necessarily match up one and the other, right?
Very practical for sure.
Right. So a lot of it's practical common sense, right? So yeah.
Sure. One quick question here, as you mentioned, reasonability can be pretty subjective. Is there another avenue to take to determine general reasonability, or is it a rule of thumb just pretty much always or generally to involve a legal professional or HR professional or some combination thereof?
It's not subjective at all in this case. In this case, it's fairly clear. You have some doctors who would say certain things which aren't consistent with what the healthcare professionals are. For instance, if you think about it, if you think, look at the U.S. Senate, right? What's that guy? There's one guy there who's a doctor who's on the Senate. He's got the curly hair. I forget his name, right? He says all this stuff. He always goes head to toe. He always goes head to head with Fauci, right? So do you listen to him or do you listen to Fauci?
Mm-hmm.
You listen to Fauci, right? You don't listen to him because he's more fringe.
Mm-hmm.
You listen to healthcare people who are in public health, the weight and the authority, and it's very clear and has never wavered about the effectiveness, the safety, the vaccines. There are people who don't believe it, but they're in the minority.
Mm-hmm.
The objective standard is with people like Strang, with all the healthcare professional doctors, with, for instance, Lisa Barrett, who we see on TV, with all the people who appear on TV, right? The government, what they say in their Health Protection Act stuff. So it's not subjective at all. It's pretty clear what the objective evidence is.
In terms of accommodations and in relation to human rights, there is a question here as well around, is there a specific sort of line of I guess feedback or sort of perspective that we should take into account with if we have an employee who is citing more a cultural or a systemic reason for not being vaccinated? So the example that's given here is, if you have a member of your staff who's part of a racialized community like an African Nova Scotian, First Nations, and so on, and they're citing this lack of trust alongside there. I'm assuming, the best course of action is to try and encourage them to use the science, read the science, and go with that. But you're dealing with a much deeper concern.
So, I mean, again, as I said, the refusal to be vaccinated is not a get out of jail free card, right? So if they cite those purposes and, you may or may not want to challenge them. If you don't, you probably wouldn't. But at the same time, then, okay, if you don't do that, then what can you do? How can they be accommodated? In some situations, they can't be accommodated, so they can't come to work. So it's not you trying to force someone to get a vaccine or trying to force them to take a certain action. It's if they, to work here, you need this. If you don't have this, this is what you can do. And this is how we can accommodate. Now, none of the accommodations work. This, the transmission, the how you get sick from this vaccine kind of is the same for everybody in the world, right? So maybe they can't work. And then the question is, do you terminate? Do you suspend? Like, what's the impact on your business?
And that's when the expertise, again, just in terms of ensuring due diligence is really
Right.
coming into play in terms of documentation, I would think.
Right. So I would never want an absolute rule that says, you know, if you don't have this vaccine, you're going to get terminated. But, you know, as part of your reasonableess is saying, okay, if someone is not vaccinated and they cite a potentially legitimate purpose, what can I do? What can I do instead? If vaccine doesn't work, what will work? Will masking work? Will regular testing work? Will all those things? And if they say we can't do any of that, then are you able to accommodate them at all? And if you're not able to accommodate them, the risk of harm is real. So at that point, you know, the risk of harm would likely win over having that person come to work. Because we know how it spreads, right? And it's not just for your workers, it's for their families, for their children, for, you know, everyone they can come contact with. So it's a big deal.
From an ID, or rather from a proof of vaccine perspective, you know, the comments been made by a few people both elsewhere in here today, and some of the commentary around the fact that it is somewhat counterfeit, you know, not counterfeit proof. There is likelihood that there will probably be counterfeit vaccine cards out there. You know, is this going to be similar to proof of age for licensees, for example? Are you going to be expected to basically just demonstrate reasonable proof in checking validity of these things? Yeah. I
would think so. That's the test they'll use, because you're not an insurer, right? You're not the one who's issued the proof of vaccine. You're not the one who controls all these things. And all you can do is take reasonable steps. And generally speaking, at law, when you strip away everything else, if you've acted reasonably, if you've done your best, then that's generally enough. If you don't care, if you turn a blind eye, you know, if you're reckless about it, well, no, you're going to get in trouble. So
if you have any questions, asking for backup ID is completely a legitimate step to take.
Sometimes I've seen situations where they come in with their passport, and then they also ask to see picture ID to confirm the name on the passport is the name on, you know, to confirm that the person who's presenting the ID is actually the person that has the passport. I've seen that happen, right? And if you're not collecting, you're just looking, and that really limits you're worried about privacy concerns.
Right. One of the side questions from this same attendee is just saying, you know, this does mean some additional staff duties in terms of time and labor and so on. Could this constitute potential undue hardship on a business? Is there an argument potentially here for an operator to say that it's undue hardship for us to be checking this, and maybe we don't have to check as a result?
So I guess the question is, you know, every case has to be weighed on its facts, and we need to know more about your business. But if you're going to start spreading COVID and you're ready to be shut down, I guess you have to figure out where's the bigger hardship. Right.
We have a tour operator. Oh, sorry. I was just going to jump right into the next one here. So we do have a tour operator, and I think this is similar to our other question around events. You can ask for proof of vaccine in an online booking process. You know, tour operators as well. That's, you know, they're often booking international visitors, people coming for longer periods of time, etc. So can you ask for proof of vaccine in the online booking process, or can it only be shown in person? And based on what we just said from a privacy perspective, it may be that you want them to commit to signing a waiver or declaration that they indeed are meeting or able to meet the proof of vaccine requirement, but then not having to show it until they arrive.
Look, I would, it's just a common sense thing, right? I mean, you can do just about, there are no hard and fast rules now, right? We're just trying to figure out what makes the most sense, given that you have reasonable duties. Now, as this thing goes forward, and as the government passes more regulation, as we get more into it, what I say may be completely changed, right? Because I don't have the guidance. No one has the guidance yet. We don't know what government's thinking. But, I would think it would make most sense to say you will be required to provide proof of vaccine to go on your journey and collect it or look at it at the time, rather than having them give it to you right away. Because the fact of the matter is, if you collect data, then you have to store data. You have to, you get all the PIPEDA things. You have to figure out how to, keep it confidential, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It creates a whole administrative nightmare, which you can avoid if you can get them to provide the proof at the time they come.
I think, one of the comments here is, there's probably nothing, but is there anything unvaccinated customers could put forward even as a legitimate argument beyond a pre-existing health condition to be allowed entry? I mean, it's not a violation of their freedom of choice. They've chosen to not get vaccinated, but is there anything else that an operator, a tourism business operator, should be prepared for in terms of an argument or pushback from a visitor in terms of their why?
Well, no, I can't imagine. That's what doing this policy thing in advance is really helpful, because you're talking about, as a tour operator, you're talking about your entire business. You're talking about all the people who come, right? And all the people who are going to enjoy this tour. And what's the impact of one person who's at risk of spreading, I mean, you have the evidence of it just in the US, right, where they had all those events and people have gone unmasked, even the political rallies, and look how people have gotten sick. And then all of a sudden you're the tour operator who lets people get sick, who people got, I got sick on that tour. I got really sick on that tour. They didn't take care of us. They didn't, or my kids got, I mean, what's the worst reputational damage? What's worse, right?
Absolutely. So basically, people should be putting something on their reservation forms now that would say, you may be asked to show proof of vaccination, or you will be.
I think it would just make sense. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good practical thing now.
And,
Okay,
so yeah, and then also listen to government. I mean, they're bringing in these policies, right? So that's going to help you, right? The passports.
Yeah. I think we're actually down to our last couple of questions here. So I'm just going to start pushing through here, and I just saw a fairly significant one pop in. I'll try to get to that one before we go. But from a practical perspective, would there be any complications that an operator should think of if they decide they want to start admitting only fully vaccinated customers prior to the actual provincial start date of October 4th? Is there any issues with putting that in place before it's being required? As a private business, again, they can make that decision for who they want to admit at any time. So they can make that decision now. So if they wanted to do that, just reinforcing again, prior to October 4th, they can do so. Yes, and we're just, I'm seeing it's come up a few different times, so I'm reinforcing it a few times to make sure people get that message.
So that's the general rule, right? We would like to know what you do. So for instance, hospitals, okay, they can't refuse people to come in because that's their business. So what I'm telling you is that, generally speaking, yes, that's all very true. You can start asking now. It's also good to take a look at your circumstances and why is there some, and I can't imagine what it would be, some obligation to have unvaccinated people, but you don't have to. I mean, you can, you're not being discriminatory. You're just trying to make sure everyone's safe, and the safety is the rule and the consideration. Then you're going to more likely not be in the good, right?
Yeah. So my final two here, and I'm going to try and make this longer one a little bit tighter. I think the question here is more around gender identity and privacy. So likely vaccination proof is the name on the health card. If somebody would go by a different name for whatever reason, whether that be gender identity or anything along those lines, will there be at some point, do you think, sort of an outline of some best practices around checking IDs, checking and storing that information? I think especially around events where there may be multiple checkpoints or multiple access points for multiple people checking that.
Right. So what we can start. So when we start getting the specifics, that's something you have to kind of meet. It's something we would have to look at and draft policies and procedures, right? I mean, there are ways to deal with that. I'm sure we can work on that, and that's how we'd have to work with you. So it's really hard for me to give you specific advice on specific things. I can give you general advice, but if you come to us, or any lawyer, not just us, but any lawyer who's working in the area, we can help you draft the type of policies that you need to make sure you're compliant, not having, minimizing any risk of running into problems with, human rights.
Awesome.
Right?
No, that's perfect. So, and I think this actually leads to our final kind of question and wrap up component. So, from the perspective of many operators, the sense is, once we have our policies developed, how do we make sure it's approved or validated before we distribute it? No operator wants to create a document that they painted themselves into a corner. And so, from a policy perspective, I'll jump in and partially answer this as well for everybody and say, as part of our TRI supports for that program, developing these types of policies and working with industry with expertise such as Ron and his team, to have that right lens on it is really important to get advice and understand that you've got the right information and that you've got it framed in the right way in terms of protecting yourself and getting it right. Ron?
Right. Yeah, and document why you think this policy is reasonable, what you've done. Because reasonableness means this: you're not an insurer, you're not going to get it perfect. You're going to get it as right as possible. And as long as you've done that, you've done the most you can to protect yourself, and courts generally respect that.
Absolutely. That's fabulous. Awesome.
Yeah.
So I think on that note, I'm going to wrap up this. I'll call it our opening webinar on this topic, because I feel like this is probably going to lead to a lot of ongoing discussion. There's a lot more things to come down the the pipes as things evolve and as government policy may shift, as our industry understanding and adoption of these processes sort of becomes hopefully a bit more sophisticated over the next little while. I will say that again, Tie-ins is here for you. Those of you on this call that are looking for additional one-on-one targeted support, please jump onto the Tourism Strong portal after this. Go to the reactivation tab for the TRI program and send us an inquiry form, and we'll be happy to work with you confidentially to support you, to connect you to any supports that may be of assistance. But I just want to say thank you so much, Ron, for sharing your insight and perspective with us today on this topic. It certainly generated lots of questions, lots of commentary, and I know, like I said, this is just sort of the beginning of this piece as we evolve into the next step. So appreciate your time, and I'll look forward to talking with everybody soon. Thank you all.
Yeah, I will tell you one thing before everyone goes, right? It generated just as much conversation among the lawyers in the office and lawyers with other lawyers, right? Like, we're all talking about what are we going to do? So yeah.